All right, so we made it to the last panel when we're going to talk about energy resilience and energy networks. So the Dean of the College of Social Science and the Humanities, Dean Ute Poiger, will be introducing this panel.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and it's my pleasure to introduce the last panel of this very exciting conference. I hear that you have had, and I have to apologize for not being able to be here all day. I hear that you have had very invigorating conversations all day, and I would have expected nothing less from seeing this process, this new institute emerge, and also from seeing the program with the wonderful multidisciplinary efforts at tackling big questions that clearly have been the main issue for both the Institute and for the agenda of its inaugural conference. So let me start by congratulating the law school on founding the new Center for Law, Innovation and Creativity, and congratulating all of you who have put this day of exchanges together. I'm very pleased that this inaugural conference was conceived in such a way to cement partnerships between the law school and research efforts at Northeastern that are designed to tackle big questions of our day, grand challenges, as our engineering colleagues would sometimes call them, through multidisciplinary efforts, and to make law, regulation, governance, transparency key themes as we are engaging in these big questions of our day. Our panel this afternoon highlights work that is emerging between my college, the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, and the university's newly founded Global Resilience Institute, as well as the School of Law. And the focus for the panel, as you know, is resilience, and in particular, the emphasis is on energy resilience. Jessica Silby, Lee Breckenridge, and Jenny Stevens have put together a panel in this space that will really cement our work in energy resilience, work that we will be pursuing further. I'm very pleased to say to all of you, with the arrival of Shalanda Baker as the first jointly appointed professor of law and public policy who will be coming into this space beginning this summer. The College of Social Sciences and Humanities has as its organizing philosophy and educational model a term that we frequently refer to, namely the term experiential liberal arts. And what that means for us is that the liberal arts at Northeastern are very much about intertwining our research, teaching, and engagement mission. And you can imagine that from that perspective, engaging with institutions outside of the university from the perspective of the liberal arts is very, very important. Energy resilience certainly lends itself to thinking about those questions. Particularly important for us is also engagement with policy, with governance. And so there's much that we can do in interdisciplinary efforts in our collaborations with the School of Law. And the concept of resilience so much focused on how individuals, societies, states, corporations, the private sector respond to disaster as well as long-term challenges in our natural and built environment is, I think, a particularly fruitful concept for fostering the kind of asking and answering of big questions that we are after at Northeastern and in the multi-institutional conversations that we want to foster further. So it's with great pleasure then that I will turn over the panel to the moderator, Lee Breckenridge, who will introduce all our panelists. I hope that as you are listening to these conversations with folks from, indeed, government, the private sector, as well as academicians, that you will keep in mind that this interlinking is really so important, not just for the future of academia, but for the future, of course, of our world. We all know that our students are intensely interested at this point in questions of energy resilience. These questions, of course, very much relate to our survival as societies. They also relate to questions of the resilience of communities, including indigenous communities. And so I very much look forward to hearing the multiple perspectives that we can bring to these big questions. And again, congratulations to all of you who are the founders of this mission, and we look forward in CSSH to many more collaborations with your new institute.
Thank you so much. So this panel is, underneath it all, about climate change. We have to remember the underlying mission, which is to wean society from fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions, and to somehow transform the way in which we use our atmosphere so that it doesn't change in a truly disastrous way. And as part of that, we're talking about a shift to renewable energy. In part, this is a shift that's underway. And in part, this is something we're striving for in transforming our economy and the institutions that go along with it. I should say that this panel, in an interesting way, is also, like the last panel, about the sharing economy, because as we see innovations in renewable energy, we are also seeing a potential shift toward decentralized generation of energy. We are seeing consumers of energy turning into potential producers of energy, trying to feed back into a newly reorganized system. So solar panels, decentralized storage systems, maybe even your electric car sitting in the driveway helping to store energy and then feed it back to the grid. These are all forms of reorganization that involve technological innovation, but also institutional innovation and really transformative changes to the way we coordinate things with each other. And in that context, I should say that autonomous sensing, algorithmic controls, these digital technologies are playing a really crucial role in piecing all of this together. So we are extremely fortunate today to have 4 wonderful speakers who have each been on the ground, part of trying to help this transition to renewable energy happen. I'm going to introduce them ever so briefly in a thumbnail sketch and then let them, I hope, elaborate a little bit on their very diverse experiences as they talk about observations and recommendations for change. First of all, Anne Berwick is, interestingly enough, currently Director of Sustainability for the City of Newton. This is a brand new job and quite an interesting addition to a past series of very important positions. Most recently, I guess, as the chair of the Department of Public Utilities under Governor deVal Patrick through 2015. Josh Castonguay is Vice President of Innovation and Generation at Green Mountain Power, which is a truly innovative, interesting power company in Vermont that's taking a leadership role in integrating renewable energy into a larger system. John Clavens is the founder of the Clavens Law Group, where he facilitates all kinds of transactions for launching innovative projects in clean energy and other wonderful ventures with positive social impact, and where he also gives much inspiration to Northeastern University School of Law co-op students who always come back fired up to change the world. And finally, Jenny Stevens, my wonderful, relatively new colleague in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, who is the Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science, and Policy, and also Associate Director of the new Global Resilience Institute. I'm going to start our panel discussion just by pitching the following broad question to our panelists. What key characteristics do you see, have you seen on the ground in your work in this renewable energy transition that you would like to highlight here, drawing on your experiences. And we can start with Jenny Stevens.
So thank you for staying throughout the day or coming for this session. I think there are a lot of parallels and themes for those of us who have been here throughout the day that I think are really interesting. First of all, it is May Day. So thinking about jobs and thinking about the last panel that really talked about workers' conditions. And I think this panel, when we think about energy, obviously in the current political discourse, jobs is a big hook for discussions about energy, whether or not the perceptions of where the jobs are versus where the jobs are going to be in the future is something we can discuss. I also just returned from Washington, D.C., where I was at the People's Climate March over the weekend. And apparently, right just a few hours before the climate march, the EPA took down additional climate science websites and information, which is, as I see it, is very connected to our energy system. Because I think one of the things a theme is that Sarah asked actually at the lunch keynote, is the internet ruining our democracy? And I can ask a very similar question, is our dominant fossil fuel energy system ruining our democracy? Because there's a very close ties with the fossil fuel industry and the politics that are going on right now. So with that, I wanted to kind of just we're each going to give a brief introduction to what we study and what work we do to introduce and begin the panel. And I guess I will start with I'm a professor here, and I do work on energy transformation, energy system change, and my background has been environmental science and environmental engineering, but increasingly as I study the energy system, I've become more and more interested in the social and political dimensions of the energy system change. And we tend to think about energy systems as very technological, and obviously the technology is critical, but a lot of the innovation and a lot of the barriers to innovation and change are really in the social, political realm and in the cultural change and institutional, how our utilities or other organizations are dealing with the very rapidly changing dynamic. And I guess that's a good introduction for this whole panel, is that the energy systems are changing, are I think more dynamic than many of us even realize in terms of the potential for change and the pace of change right now, but also it could be even faster, and there's resistance to that change. And so I like to begin with kind of this visual that we really are moving gradually, from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a more renewable-based energy system. On some level, on some time frame, we know we are ultimately going to be in a more renewable-based system. And I think the way I characterize a lot of what's happening right now is that the people and organizations that are profiting from the fossil fuel-based system and our institutions and even our culture, we are all part of the system. We are kind of stuck, and it's hard to move because there's a lot of change that needs to happen because it's so ingrained deeply in our society. So I want to introduce just a couple of ideas and concepts that I have that I think are helpful to think about this political and cultural and institutional change. And one is this notion of energy democracy, which is really a redefining of thinking about energy, how our energy system is connected to our political system and our communities and our power relationships in society. And it's really a way of shifting from energy consumers to thinking more about energy citizens and energy prosumers in terms of producing our own energy, and thinking about energy as a public good rather than a commodity, and again, shifting the control of the energy system away from a few large multinational corporate entities toward more public and community control. And I think one of the things, and one of the ways we can think about for this conference, thinking about connected futures and different configurations, this figure just shows that our legacy centralized system has been dominated by large power plants that then we have an extensive transmission and distribution network to connect us. But as we think about a future that has more renewables, we can envision communities and regions of the world with very different mixes of energy sources, locally appropriate mix of solar, wind, tidal, geothermal, lots of different possibilities, and lots of different kinds of organizations, companies, cooperatives, communities that are engaging with these heterogeneous systems in very different ways. So you have a potential of very different connections, right, among all of that network and those systems. One of the things that comes up when we think about a renewable energy future is the degree to which we're going to have large-scale renewables versus local distributed renewable-based systems, and sometimes this comes up in the dialogue or discourse as a competition. Like some people are really pushing for large scale, and obviously with the ambitious climate and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, large scale. There's an urgency issue and an attempt to kind of move quickly with large amounts of energy. But some of the distributed and kind of empowering local communities and thinking about community resilience, the more distributed model is also is advocated by, and different mechanisms support each of these. So that's something that we can address, and I think maybe some of the other speakers will address. I also just wanted to return to this notion of energy system resilience and thinking about, Uta mentioned the Global Resilience Institute, which is a new initiative here at Northeastern that is really university-wide, encouraging resilience research of all kinds across campus and integrating this theme of resilience, which obviously is a very broad theme that can be conceptualized lots of different ways, but really thinking about preparing for, learning from, and adapting to disruptions of all kinds. And we think about sudden disruptions like storms or accidents or terrorism, but also thinking about longer chronic stresses or slowly emerging disruptions, including growing inequality in society or slowly increasing sea level rise or things like that. But when we think about our energy system, Superstorm Sandy highlighted for a lot of the United States and around the world some of the vulnerabilities that we have in terms of we are now, with our electronic devices and our phones and our computers and our internet dependency, we are more reliant than ever on having access to electricity. We can't pay our bills, we can't communicate, we can't, buy our food without our energy system. So just highlighting the dependence there is really critical. So with that, I think I will leave this slide up as we go through, and the other panelists will touch on some different aspects of the same general topical area. So thank you.
So each of us was, as you've heard, asked to talk a bit about our career path and also about sort of substantive points we want to make arising out of that path. So I think the substantive points I want to make are hopefully a little more interesting than my career path. So I'm going to start there and hope that you will stick with me through the whole 4 minutes or 3 minutes. So I think the main points I want to make is that we actually know very well how to address climate change. It's remarkably simple. And what's missing is not the know-how, but the political will. And here's how we do it. The first step is energy efficiency and conservation. So use less energy, right? So that can mean a lot of things. It can mean walking or riding a bike instead of driving a car. It can mean insulating the walls. It can mean turning off the lights. It can mean switching out the kind of light bulbs we use, but use less. Step 2 is, for that electricity we do need to use, make it green. Right now, our electricity mainly comes from fossil fuels, certain renewables, and nuclear energy. The fossil fuels can, at least in some substantial part, be replaced by renewables. What else do we use energy for? Mainly for transportation and building heating and cooling. So the answer is use more electricity. Maybe it sounds counterintuitive, but the fuels we use for transportation, mainly gasoline and diesel, can't really be made much cleaner. Natural gas and oil for building heating also can't be made a lot cleaner. But what we can do is green the electric grid and then use that electricity for everything we use energy for, or as much as we can for what we use energy for. So those are the simple steps, really. Energy conservation and efficiency, green the grid, use that green electricity for other purposes as well as for conventional electricity purposes. And I just want to observe, and as part of that story, that natural gas is not a clean fuel. And so if we're replacing natural gas for building heating, we want to replace it with clean electricity, because although the folks who sell natural gas will tell you that it is clean, in many respects it is not. And we'll see if we have the time to talk about that further. Okay, so my career path, I really wouldn't call it a path, and my main message to you is that planning is overrated. I went to law school to be a legal services lawyer. It ended up that my enthusiasm for hiking and skiing brought me to environmental law, and then from there, inevitably, I think, to energy. I worked in the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts after Lee Breckenridge, or not right after Lee, but shortly thereafter. And she actually had a lot more skills and experience to be there than I did. And then I worked in the Alaska Attorney General's office in Anchorage for a bit. And one interesting observation I will make about working in Anchorage is that there are an awful lot of lawyers from Northeastern there, because Alaska doesn't have a law school. They end up having a lot of co-op students there, and a lot of those guys stay. And it's amazing the extent to which the judiciary in Alaska is made up of Northeastern grads. So anyway, just an observation. As Lee said, I am Director of Sustainability currently in the City of Newton, and I spent 8 years in the Patrick administration, first as Undersecretary for Energy, and then as Chair of the Department of Public Utilities. And if I were starting over again, I would definitely work on energy and climate change for all kinds of reasons that I think you guys all know. Among them, the important one, that the planet really depends on our solving these problems. And it would be great to be a lawyer and engineer and understand finance, but most of us don't have the luxury of going to school for that many years. So I really recommend, from whatever perspective you end up working on climate and energy, if that's your interest, that you do it, and there are lots of ways to make important contributions.
Thank you. And now Josh.
Okay. Hello. Again, so Josh Castlegate, thank you very much for having me. Quick, my background, I live up in Burlington, Vermont, work for Green Mountain Power, We're an energy transformation company in Vermont. I grew up in Maine. I studied at University of Maine electrical engineering, graduated in 2003, and have been at GMP since. And my path there has been all over the place. Under our CEO, Mary Powell, who at the time when I started was COO, was pretty willing to let you dive in as far and fast as you wanted to in terms of kind of pushing the envelope. So at a pretty early point in my career, I was able to do some cool things in terms of energy transformation with our team, and that's kind of led me to doing this work. So again, I say we're an energy transformation. I can't think of like a worse word than utility. We've tried to shed that word every step of the way because it's ugly, but it's also not what we are. This whole thing, I mean, Jenny said it in her intro remarks around this, it's a time of energy transformation. We look at it as we need to transform this energy delivery system to one that is much more home, business, community based. It's a delivery system that hasn't changed in well over a century. When you really look at it, we're starting to make a few steps there, but it's a system that is at best 50% efficient when you look from the start to the finish, when you create energy, what it takes to get there to when it turns into light or whatever you need it for. And even, and the climate impacts aside, Mother Nature is not backing down, believe it or not. Like if we keep replacing and making systems more robust. You mentioned, Sandy and Irene, very devastating to the Northeast. Those are getting, closer together, those kinds of storms. I run our team of hydro generation in Vermont, and we see 100-year flood events every year and a half. So it's the data is obvious. But you've got this system that relies on large power plants, many miles of delivery system, transmission lines, distribution lines, and there's plenty to go wrong in between. Again, not to mention the efficiency of delivering that. You look at every other method of delivery, whether it's goods and services to your home and how you do that today versus how you get music and media and entertainment to how you communicate with friends, that has all drastically changed. Even transportation, as we've learned in experience, there's a lot of changes that have gone on there. The energy system is really ripe for this transformation, and we're leaning in heavy to this energy revolution. And then the costs of maintaining the system are just not sustainable, both from an environmental impact and what's going to happen to future generations to come, but also in a pure monetary standpoint. I mean, the U.S. has spent tens of billions of dollars on transmission over the last year. Outages, just power outages, have cost $50 to $60 billion in just economic impact, and that's not even including the cost it takes to restore everything. So it's a significant amount of money that's going into managing this system that hasn't changed and needs to change. GMP, Green Mountain Power, is the first and was only until recently B Corporation. So if anybody knows what B Corp is, basically it actually changes your governance and bylaws to be able to look at more than just bottom line when it comes, if you were ever to sell your organization, for example, or how you want to run from a cultural standpoint. We were the first energy company in the world actually to move to this B Corporation standpoint, which even the B Corp team couldn't believe we made it there. We were right up there with Ben and Jerry's, which is power and ice cream. That's pretty cool. So that's just a little bit. Again, I've been at GMP since 2003. I live with my wife and two kids up in Burlington, Vermont, and made the trek down this morning. I appreciate being here and get into more here after John goes.
So I'll tell you by myself, and then I'm going to disagree with something Josh had said. So I have a private practice and really focus, as Lee said, on doing transactions, really making things happen on the ground level in this clean energy economy. Some of what we do is helping emerging clean technology companies get formed and financed. A lot of what we do is helping small distributed solar, wind, hydro, anaerobic digestion, other projects get permitted, developed, financed, and so on. I began doing this work about 13 years ago, and so here's where I'll break from Josh in a couple of respects. So one, as he said, the electricity system is antiquated. It is antiquated, but if you think of it, if you think of some of what else has been discussed at the conference today, in terms of the internet and networks, if you could have described the system, say, 150 years ago, that would connect all homes in New England in some fundamental way that they use every single day, most minutes of every day, think, oh, are we talking about the internet? No, we're talking about the electricity grid, which has been around. So interestingly, it's a good example of our first really robust network, and a totally fascinating network where one of the fascinating elements of it, but one of the antiquated elements, is that without energy storage getting developed and coming to the fore, every electron produced has to be consumed or wasted in the moment it's generated. So antiquated, but also really instantaneous and connected network as well. The last thing I'll say in a quick introduction is most of the things that I do now, despite that we're still stuck very much in just the beginnings of a transformation to a decarbonized economy, wouldn't have existed 15 years ago. And now exist due to a lot of the changes that we're talking about in other contexts of transportation, taxi, Uber drivers, internet generally, the way information flows. So the electricity industry was restructured in the 1990s in Massachusetts and in many other states across the country. Not fully, so it's not the Wild West, but restructured so that the old vertically integrated utilities that had a monopoly over not only distribution, sale of electricity, but also generation of electricity. Now, in Massachusetts, just have a monopoly over distribution, except for in certain municipal territories. So all of a sudden, that creates a market for the things that utilities don't have a monopoly in. So that's deregulation. What about regulation? Has played a role too. There are multiple examples, but one key example are renewable portfolio standards, which are an example of a very cool market-based regulatory mechanism to require that utilities' portfolio of wholesale power include a certain percentage of green power. So it's a regulation from on high, but they don't tell you how to achieve that percentage. And there comes the market opportunity. So I'll stop there with some of those innovations and we'll continue.
Thank you so much. I want to ask our panelists, I guess broadly speaking, a question about current opportunities and challenges in trying to make this shift. I know we see in the literature, so to speak, or in New York's reports as they innovate in their system, we see, for example, some talk about how wonderful it will be to incorporate right down to the most small scale distributed generation and storage, integrate that into the grid system, and then feed it back. And so on the one hand, you see quite a lot of advocacy and optimistic statements about how many wonderful things will come from that. Not just the ability of local, even landowners, residential landowners, to participate in the making of the energy, or the capturing of the energy, but also there's talk about participatory engagement with the utility, that is local people being able to converse with and interact with and teach and learn from these more centralized aggregators, I guess I will say, of energy who are then distributing on their behalf. But on the other hand, you start to see comments about institutional obstacles, and a number of you have mentioned obstacles and challenges and difficulties in making this optimistic vision come to pass. So I think I'd like to ask, maybe starting with you, Josh, what are the most important sort of opportunities that you see for innovation, either technological or institutional, that you're working on at the moment?
Sure. Yeah, so, I think I agree with what John said about thinking of this system like a data network, really. I mean, it has and still does serves an extremely important purpose. And what we're thinking about with it is how do we convert this into what is currently still a mostly one-way, sort of one-directional system to a multi-directional system, and the complexities with that, and to what Lee is getting at, you move from having, take New England for example, maybe there's a few thousand larger power plants, and then you've got millions of homes, to something that's going to be millions and millions of points out on the system, truly like a high-speed computer system, having to control in real time, or where it comes into the innovation is around the storage of energy. It is the one area, electricity, the one form of energy that has not really had a robust, larger scale way to store it for, other than your car battery and some of the smaller sites. So that technology has really evolved. I mean, the opportunity is huge to move to this transition to this sort of model of distributed approach. The technology is there. I mean, how you put it together is still, there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of IP being developed in terms of the algorithms, and when you think about scaling this stuff up back to the millions and millions of data points, you can't have some wizard behind the curtain pulling strings all day. That's just not going to be a sustainable model. So, how you sort of develop the autonomy of a system like that. I think the other side of the equation, though, is for it to be adopted and work, it has to be amazingly simple for the customers around that interact with energy. You can't complicate folks' lives any more than they already are to have them be making a lot of new decisions, I don't think anyway. So a lot of that has to happen behind the scenes and sort of be automatic and drive down costs, reduce the carbon footprint overall, make it way more reliable, and even improve customers' lives and comfort. So that's where I think there's a lot of ripeness right now for innovation there.
Thank you. And Anne, I was going to ask you, since you have this deep background in state-level regulation in all kinds of different capacities, in terms of the institutional opportunities and challenges, were there any sort of innovations in institutional arrangements that you thought looked especially promising or challenging? Are we looking at the end of the day towards new forms of subsidies to make things happen, or are we looking at new forms of constraints in order to make these systems work better?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we still have enormous barriers in terms of political will and culture. And I don't know that we really have come up with ideas about institutional approaches that will solve those problems. So what I mentioned when I started was this, what I consider to be sort of my bumper sticker speech about energy efficiency and then green the grid and then use more electricity. So just start with energy efficiency. What have we done in this country sort of institutionally to address the fact that we waste enormous amounts of energy? And so our energy efficiency programs, which are great, and Massachusetts is like 6th year running, first in the nation, but think about really where you're going to get energy efficiency. Think about Western Europe, where without really a diminution of lifestyle for the most part, you get per capita energy use that is half of ours. So that's that kind of conservation. Energy efficiency isn't just about insulating homes and changing out light bulbs, right? It's about living in much smaller spaces and driving different kinds of vehicles, smaller, much more efficient. So I think that a lot of what we've done is institutionally is really important. Renewable portfolio standards, net metering, programs that encourage, incentivize energy efficiency. But I don't think they get at the fundamentals, which is how do we drastically reduce our per capita energy use, and how do we make much cleaner the energy that we do use. And I think some of the answers to that are carbon pricing, right? Will be, I think we would still need renewable portfolio standards, net metering and the like. I don't think carbon pricing actually eliminates all that. But that would, think about if you go to Europe and buy a gallon or a liter of gasoline, it costs petrol, it costs a whole lot more than it costs here, right? So we have to have pricing of carbon that reflects our values, and we have to have a lifestyle in terms of energy efficiency that also reflects those values. And I hate to be kind of a wet blanket, but I think although the approaches we've taken around things like renewable portfolios and efficiency standards are useful, I don't think they get at the really crucial underpinnings of the ways in which we need to reduce our carbon footprint. And also, in continuing my wet blanket role, I will say that even if we look at Europe and say, whoa, they use half the energy we do on a per capita basis in Western Europe, even there, and even with all the commitments that were made under the Paris Agreement, the world is nowhere close to getting to, quote, well below, which is what the Paris Agreement requires, well below 2 degrees centigrade, right? So 1.5 degrees centigrade, even if all the countries that committed in Paris did everything they were committed to, we wouldn't be on that track. So it's nice to talk about getting to European efficiency standards and European per capita energy use, but we're not close to moving in that direction. Even the great things that President Obama did, and I'm a huge fan, and I worked for Governor Patrick for 8 years, and I think tooting our own horns, we did great things in the Patrick administration. We're not moving where we need to be.
Thank you. And I know now I can turn to John, who down in the weeds of transactions knows that there are at least some wonderful new opportunities coming along for piecing together a type of coordination that will be helpful.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. Just picking up on what others have said, and then providing some additional thoughts. So, one, Anne talking about mainly leading with the goal of environmental protection, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's worth thinking in this form about how much is that our goal, and where we introduce ideas like energy democracy, it's a more cost-effective and better way of achieving environmental goals. Or are we trying to balance achievement of multiple objectives? Could we achieve better, quicker, maybe cheaper environmental gains through some completely, let's call it, totalitarian system, but that loses democratic values? Or is there something inherent about distributed, democratic, prosumer energy that's a way of really, rocking the climate change boat? I don't have an answer for that. That's a question the smarter people on the panel can answer. The other thing I would say about Anne talking about carbon pricing may ultimately be more effective than something like renewable portfolio standards, but they both share a really important feature, which is the government setting a goal and letting the market find ways of achieving it, ideally in the most efficient way possible. Josh talking about how important it was to make things easy. I was just at another conference with real estate lawyers this morning who are not solar lawyers, and I was talking to them about solar and introducing factors to consider if their residential clients are trying to go solar or buy and sell homes with solar panels. So I went through some of the details, and so let's just say you're a homeowner and trying to go solar in Massachusetts. You got to think about, are you going to purchase a system yourself? Are you going to get a solar loan? Are you going to get it from a bank? Or are you going to get it from a solar loan provider? Are you going to own your own SRECs? What the hell are SRECs? They're solar renewable energy certificates. How do you sell them? You need somebody else's help to sell them. You can't sell them yourself because you're too small to sell them. You need to have net metering. Well, net metering, maybe you need it if your system is big enough that you're going to export in one billing month's time. But if you don't net export, you can benefit from the displacement value because you're using all the energy on site when you use it. So what do? And who do you buy it from? And is the warranty any good? And this is not a dishwasher. So one of the comments we got from the real estate lawyers was, gee, isn't anybody trying to make this simpler so that more people would adopt solar on their homes? And yes, there's been tremendous achievement of solar, but is that complexity necessary? Is that complexity an example of democracy and choice? And lots of innovative market concepts. Would it be better for building codes to just require that all homes have solar panels? Boom, done. Nobody has a choice. Let me stop there and add more. Next questions.
Well, first I want to maybe pitch this to Jenny in part. In these reconfigurations of arrangements, relationships between the participants in our energy system, we do see some possibilities of shifting costs and benefits. And because of that, we see some potential implications for fairness, for equity, for not just access to the system, but for participating in a robust way and garnering the benefits. And I know, Jenny, you've given some thought to ways in which these newly reconfigured systems may be fair and equitable, and that I guess should put in as a footnote that can take the form of money or valuable resources. We also have a theme that we haven't touched on really that came up earlier this morning, which is the privacy concerns. Once you're participating in these bigger systems, with your whole house all networked, you've got also, in essence, the possibilities of government intrusion into sort of private concerns, which is a different sort of fairness question. Do either of those themes strike a chord with you?
Sure. So I've done some work thinking about the workforce, the energy workforce, and its composition and diversity and inclusion in the energy workforce. And as the workforce is changing right now with a lot of potential for new jobs, it's really an opportunity for diversifying the workforce and offering and training and broadening participation in energy jobs among a broader group of people or individuals in our society. And another thing to be thinking about is in terms of renewable incentives. A lot of the earliest incentives have really inadvertently perpetuated inequalities because only wealthier people who can invest in, who have the capital to invest have benefited. So increasingly now people are more aware of that and trying to adjust and encourage and support the benefits more broadly to lower income communities as well. I also wanted to just connect some of the equity issues and justice issues with the kind of quite strategic, what we're learning now more and more is how the energy companies, the large multinational energy companies have strategically and very intentionally been resisting the change and a lot of these changes. And in doing this in multiple ways, including misinformation campaigns, were telling us, well, first of all, the whole climate denial, like telling us that, encouraging us to believe that burning fossil fuels is benign or benevolent, and we shouldn't be worried about it, and we need it for ours to live and to have the lifestyles that we want. And so we've been very intentionally cultivated to believe that for decades. And I have solar panels on my roof, and a neighbor walked by last summer, and he looked up at them and he said, "Do those things really work? I heard they were a hoax." And, this is in Massachusetts where, people really have had misinformation about the technologies, about climate science, about fossil fuels and the impacts of fossil fuels. And another thing we don't think about is the extraction of fossil fuels. And it's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions. The extraction of fossil fuels, coal, whether it be coal, fracking, or conventional oil exploration, there's all kinds of social and economic impacts to communities. There's also health impacts associated with our fossil fuel dominant system that aren't integrated into the costs of what we pay. So we're in a very, we've been just evolving in a system that just isn't fairly accounting for all of the negative societal impacts. And those impacts are disproportionately impacting lower income and more disadvantaged communities across the board. So I think that's another. But on a more optimistic note, I would just say that one of the things that I see, particularly since the election, is an integration of different social movements. Energy and climate change have been kind of siloed, and it isn't what most people wake up thinking about and worrying about. And I think there's been criticism of the environmental movement and how people have been engaging with these issues of climate change and energy. And I think I see optimism in an integration of thinking about energy and climate as social justice issues and connecting with jobs and connecting with other things that are more basic to what everyone wakes up every day worrying about. So in that sense, I think there's some. I feel and I see among some networks a real kind of awakening and wanting to counter the corporate control that now has become so blatant that the influence of one of the fossil fuel industry leaders in our highest levels of government influencing our national and international policy. Again, it's so blatant that we have a new opportunity to express dissatisfaction with that and stand up for what's better for the people.
Thank you, Jenny. At this point, I'd like to open it up for just discussion here in the audience, starting with you.
Thank you. This question is for Anne. I'd like to ask you, what is your sense of the role? This question is for Anne. My question is, what's your sense of the role or prospect of cities and states bypassing the federal government and keeping our commitments to Paris and beyond, and specifically coordinating actions across cities?
I mean, I think that's where, to the extent we're going to make real progress on climate in this administration, I think that's where the action has to happen and can happen. Whether that can get us to our Paris commitment is another question. I don't know the answer to that. But I think we can make huge progress, actually, on a city and state level. So look what's going on now in the state of Massachusetts in terms of pending legislation. I don't want to talk too long because as I was listening, I thought, I want to talk about this and this and this, and I could keep going. So I'll try to limit myself just to a few points with respect to your question. But look at what's going on now in the state legislature. I mean, we've got two or more bills to increase the renewable portfolio standard some by 2% and some by 3% a year. So really require utilities on a state level to buy much more green electricity. On the municipal level, a number of cities, Newton included, are looking to adopt, and some have adopted, municipal aggregation programs that actually have a, quote, green component. So cities would actually, it take a little longer than I have to explain exactly how it works, but on behalf of their ratepayers, aggregate all their ratepayers, buy electricity as a ratepayer purchasing group, and require some of that electricity to be green. And a number of cities have required a 5% purchase. Brookline just went for a 25% purchase. So that's over and above the 12% that we're at from through the renewable portfolio standard, which may go up 2% or 3% a year. So we're talking about major municipal and state requirements to purchase green renewable sources of power, and I think that's very significant. We have as of last summer, we have an omnibus energy bill that requires utilities to purchase 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. That's a whole new industry that's on the verge of taking off in southern New England. So I think there are tons of opportunities at, for example, also encouraging the use of electric vehicles and low-emitting vehicles in general. So I think there's lots of room for activity on the state and municipal level.
My question is, do you
all like to say who you are?
I'm Hamid Megalchi. I'm the professor of mechanical engineering here. I'm the director of Master of Science in Energy Systems in College of Engineering. Is the breeder nuclear power plant clean and renewable, and should it be in the mix?
So the question is, should nuclear be,
Is it clean, renewable? You know the difference between regular nuclear reactor and a breeder nuclear reactor?
Oh, probably not.
Breeder, it breeds fuel for itself.
It creates its own fuel?
Yes, yes.
No, I've never heard of that.
Okay, well, because Secretary Muniz thinks so. You know, he considers that's a renewable and clean and should be in the mix. I was wondering, I'm debating myself,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering what you think.
I mean, I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, and I really can't answer your specific question. I, however, do not see how we meet any reasonable greenhouse gas goals without nuclear power. I mean, right now, the country has 20-some% of its generation coming from nuclear power. We've closed Vermont Yankee. We're about to close Pilgrim, which we should close. It's rickety. It shouldn't be operating. But I think without nuclear power, it's very hard to envision meeting the goals we should be adopting on and have adopted in large measure on greenhouse gas emissions.
I would just add that assumptions about how we're going to meet demand assume that demand is going to stay the same or it's going to increase. And we have a lot of potential for reducing demand. So if we were able to have deep cultural change, which many people are advocating for, and we even heard about here, where we reduced our expectations about energy consumption, and we reduced our assumptions about, and that isn't politically, it doesn't happen very often, and most people don't talk about deep shifts in energy consumption, but it's entirely possible. And if and when you re-envision the possibilities for energy consumption reduction, some of the assumptions or the statement you just made, like I don't see how we're going to do it without, can be turned upside down. So I would just counter with that energy consumption tends to be assumed as a given at a certain level, and there's lots of possibilities there for.
Can I ask one more? Okay. Well, there are lots of people putting solar panels in their houses, and they have tried to store the energy, but the batteries are the worst kind of storage, energy storage facilities. I don't know if you know it. 95% of energy is stored, maybe close even to 100, is by hydraulic. They pump the water up on the mountain and all that. Now, if people put solar energy and try to sell energy during the daytime to the utilities, how does it work? Can the utility survive with that? Everybody sells energy back to the utility and then buy it at night, so the net may be zero or a little bit, and who's going to take care of the power lines?
Yeah, so you're getting at a really hot topic question around the country and beyond, probably in terms of just policy around how, you know, you've got this system that has to continue to be paid for. If everybody's generating their own, how does it work? I think there's going to be, I mean, you've started to see some changes in terms of whether it be net metering or, you know, self-generation rules in different states. I can't speak to a lot of the other ones. In Vermont, you know, we're looking at it pretty closely in terms of, okay, we look at it simply as, what if GMP's revenues are 50% of what they are today, 10 years from now, because of that exact thing? What do we do? Are we going to go in and start trying to slow down and create new fees? No, I mean, that's not our style. I think that's been some other utility approaches. Or are we going to try to then create either a new platform that actually has some revenues being produced in the regulated model that offset some of the lost revenue there? Are we going to help transition? You know, so Vermont passed an interesting law last year, sort of like an RPS, but Vermont had to be unique. So we had this tier 3, which obligates us to help customers make a transition off of fossil fuel. So leveraging things like air source heat pumps, transportation, and helping to make it easier to electrify. So at the same time, are we strategically electrifying and sort of either flattening out that impact and also creating new revenue streams to counter that? That's, you know, that again, that's our approach. It's a little different as you work yourself around the country, though.
Hi, I'm Clark Freifeld, computer science faculty, program director of MS Health Data Analytics. Given that we are basically past the point of catastrophic impact of climate change, even if we cut our carbon emission to zero today, do you see a role for geoengineering? I know this is a controversial thing. Is that a red herring? Spraying sulfur in the atmosphere, doing these sort of wacky things to basically try to cool the planet while we figure out this grid stuff.
I mean, we've already messed the planet up so much. It makes me very nervous to talk about these untested technologies. And it's not as if we have a sort of planet B, right? So, I mean, I have to say I don't like the idea. And and remember I started with saying we actually have the technologies we need. I mean, if we change our lifestyles dramatically, and so that we're really reducing demand, and if we adopt in a very widespread basis the renewable resources we already have. I mean, for this part of the country, offshore wind has potential for 10,000 megawatts. If we do the things we know how to do, then I would rather avoid these ideas of geoengineering, which in my understanding from a non-scientist point of view are not so well developed that we can be confident about their safety. I mean, I just wanted to say one other thing, which is, for those of you who have seen An Inconvenient Truth, the Al Gore movie, remember the metaphor of the frog who jumps into boiling water versus the frog who's in a beaker of water that's slowly heated. And the frog who jumps into the hot water tries at least to get out quickly. And the frog who's in a slowly heated beaker kind of sits there and cooks. And I think right now we're more analogous to the frog in a beaker, right? It's conceivable to me that if we have, a lot of events that really bring home to people. Luckily, I'm not advocating for that, and luckily I have no control over it anyway. But if we have a lot of events that bring home to people the nature of the risk, the flood risk for Boston, for Cambridge, the disappearance of New Orleans and Miami, then maybe we start to do the kinds of things Jenny's alluding to.
It's very difficult because the sort of question also lends itself to news stories. May be true that have you passed a point of no return, in which case is everybody focusing their efforts in the wrong direction, and you should be focused on adaptation, resiliency to climate change, as opposed to spending lots of public and private dollars trying to reduce emissions too late. Hopefully, that's not the case.
I would just also add to the question about geoengineering that it's only a small handful of scientists who've thought about these ideas, and it's a very technological fix approach that fails to integrate a lot of social, political, governance concerns, a lot of risks that I think we are hard to even wrap our heads around what all of those could be. And I think there is not, I think there's a concern that scientists talking about these ideas and advancing them and highlighting the importance of, how bad it could get, and maybe we need this for as an insurance policy kind of discussions, advancing those without the people who are really going to be impacted being part of the discussion could lead to a very dangerous or not good situation in terms of legitimizing even the idea of manipulating the climate in that way. So I have some kind of deep concerns, and I think I see some parallels with carbon capture and storage, which is another set of technologies that I've studied for 10 or 15 years, where I feel like people, it's kind of appealing to think that there's some technological way out there. So, but it diminishes from the efforts of other potential changes, and so it's a real challenging thing to juxtapose. But yeah, good question.
So my question is more about global perspectives, because I think, in a sense, the panel has been quite focused on domestic policies. And globally, you'd have to say that there's a huge maldistribution of energy resources, and that many people in low and middle income countries actually have far too little access to energy resources at present. And a great deal of international policy and policy exported by the U.S. is actually focused on perpetuating the fossil fuel economy globally, to restrict access to green technologies in other countries, et cetera. So I just wonder if the panel, I know it's a big extra topic to add on at the last minute to what you've already talked about, but it does seem to me that the problem is, in a sense, even bigger, because we have to have much more energy equality globally. If we reduce, if we let other people use more, we probably even have to use less, or we have to be certain that what we're using is totally green. And we have to have policies that affect global policy as well as just national or state or local policies.
Well, I mean, I think, I don't know a lot about the international scene, but I will say one of the most important points of the Paris Agreement, it seems to me, was a commitment of G8 countries, including us, to contribute very large sums of money to, I don't know what the right term to use these days is, the politically correct term, but developing or third world countries, so that they can adopt some of the resources that we know they're going to have to adopt if they're going to start to use a lot of energy, right? So solar and electric vehicles. I think if the U.S. pulls out of Paris, and there's apparently a big debate going on in the White House as to whether or not we will, but I think even if we don't, we can count on the U.S. commitment of billions of dollars to the rest of the world, so that the rest of the world can live up to their Paris commitments. That's not going to happen, even if we don't back out, even if we don't back off Paris in name, we will back off Paris in fact, which is to say we won't make good on our billions of dollars of commitment to the rest of the world. And also, by the way, we won't continue our commitments, we already know this, to the Clean Power Plan, which is the main vehicle for the U.S. to live up to its own domestic Paris commitments. So.
Very good point, and we didn't really touch on international and energy access and the international justice issues associated with that. And there are definitely inconsistencies and U.S. investments in other countries that are perpetuating, as you mentioned. But I would also just say that other countries are, we are potentially, particularly right now, losing ground in terms of being a leader in advancing renewables in other parts of the world, and other countries will step up, I think, in our absence in the next few years, it looks like.
I was just going to add that the opportunity there is, like, with everything we've learned up until now, we have a long ways to go. Would we build the grid the same way today as we did, 100 plus years ago? Maybe not, maybe somewhat. So there is an opportunity too, in just how you think about building that infrastructure, or not, or having it be completely home-based.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and Go enjoy the reception.
Well, we're going to hear from Dean Paul to close us out, actually. Thanks very much, everybody.